and welcome back to Let's Read an Indie. I am the Writing Stickman, also known as the author Richard Massey of the Mushroom Knight series. Allow me to quickly plug the series. Boop, boop, boop. Anyway, what are we looking at today? Well, I have another fantasy story for you, Sword of the Elves by... I'm going to get this really wrong, so I do apologize in advance, my good man. Luís Falcão de Magalhães. So, what is Sword of the Elves? Well, as I said, it is a fantasy story, the first in a series called Lost Elven Realms, but it is also set in a wider world called Legends of Elessia, which the authors released several books for in various other series. And you don't need to have read any of it in order to read and enjoy this book, as I have not read any of them, and nothing barred me from following it. There are a few references to things that I suspect may be to do with events in the other books, but it's not required reading to read anything else in the series. And so to start off with, we shall look at some of the characters, and we shall begin with the main character, Frida. I hope that's how her name is pronounced. The story actually gives us a little poetic introduction to her character, detailing some of her backstory, and she's had a rough past, but where she is now is she is a former pirate captain who has lost her ship, lost her crew, and also lost her lover due to some war that's taken place. She is quite a brash character in a way, potentially unlikable considering, well, she's a thief and a pirate, but actually the story does well in making us quite empathetic with her, considering not only her past, but what is happening in the story, and I quite like her. A little addendum that I forgot to mention, Frida happens to be human, just to point out. This will be important. Anyway, then we have Silas, another human, who also happens to be the aforementioned lover of Frida. He's a scholar, but also a bit of a thief, and likes to sneak around and investigate ancient sites and cultures and lost civilizations, as it were. He's quite a sound chap, if a little on the hairy side. And the last character I want to draw to your attention is Sandalar, an elf who is also a researcher of magic and relatively reasonable to a degree, and if for selfish reasons, but he is still an elf, and we'll get to that. So let's talk about some setup, and we get an early inclination that something's happened with the elves, that they are being exiled or holding themselves up somewhere. We don't get the exact details why, but the important thing to note is that they are confined in this area, in this valley somewhere. But as for the character stuff, we actually kick off with something happening to Silas. He is in this tower with these knights doing some research, but an attack from some force is coming, and he is urged to leave but refuses and ultimately vanishes inside of a book. But really where things properly kick off is when we start following Frida. And she is drunk, very drunk, as she has lost her crew, lost her ship, and Silas has gone missing. We, of course, know that he vanished into a book, but as far as she is concerned, he died in the tower where the attack came from. So she begins in a very low spot, and she's in a room, as I said, a drunken mess, and ends up opening a book, into which she also vanishes. And here we get into the real meat of the story as Frida arrives in this distant forest, this dense land that is far from any civilization as far as she is aware. She has barely anything with her as she was sucked in during her drunken stupor. However, she is not entirely alone as eventually she finds someone else, and it happens to be her lost lover, Silas. And this would seem to be a very positive turn of events for them. They are reunited, especially considering that Frida believed that Silas was dead. However, while it most definitely is a happy occurrence, they are stuck in this forest with seemingly no way of escaping. as the forest almost seems to magically bend around them and prevent them from making progress, and they're incapable of climbing out of the forest from the cliff edges that surround it. However, Frida comes up with a plan to, shall we say, solve the problem of the forest preventing them from making any progress. This ultimately results in then learning of the true nature of this forest. This is the valley in which the elves have been contained for thousands upon thousands of years. As such, the story revolves around Frida and Silas's interactions with the elves and their desperate attempts to get away from this valley and back to human civilization. Okay, we've always got to do a few little criticisms, so let's get them out of the way nice and quick. The first, and probably the least important, is I found at the start some of the chapter divisions were a bit confusing to me. Like, is this a chapter? Is this a subsection? And what are all these dates going on about? But that's mainly in the early section that I found that a problem, and ultimately that's not to do with writing. But probably one of the bigger ones is the elves, or the wood elves that we mainly are dealing with, have this thing called the green imperative, which is a rule or law about not bringing any harm to any kind of plant, so not even stepping on a leaf. However, I find this quite unworkable with how extreme it is, considering they have to navigate through forests and stuff, and I find the idea of not stepping on any kind of plant life very hard to believe, considering what forests are like. But more so, the elves actually keep livestock, and in my experience, most livestock tend to eat plant life, which would seem in contradiction to the green imperatives, considering the elves would have to actually feed and plant life to the livestock, which would mean actually harming and damaging the plant life. But I wouldn't be surprised if elves were hypocrites. Right. On this subject, I have to be completely honest with you. I am not a fan of elves. I generally find the way they're used in lots of media very frustrating with how pompous and full of themselves they generally are. But it's also part of the reason why I used them in my own series, because as a trope I'm not a fan of, I thought, let's try and use them interestingly and differently. It also is something that I'm not averse to reading to see what other authors have done with them, whether they just fall into the usual tropes or whether they frame them differently. So, how do I feel about the elves in this story? Well, let's just say they are very interesting in their presentation. The main group of elves we're dealing with are the wood elves, and Sandalar, one of the three characters I mentioned, is one of these wood elves. And now you'd think wood elves, nice, and they live in harmony with nature and everything like that, they're quite peaceful. But what are these elves like? As far as I'm concerned, these elves, these wood elves, are completely repugnant. They are barbaric savages. Despite the fact that they have outward trappings that may fit with what one would think with, highly civilized elves, with the look of their tree and their city within this massive tree and supposed harmony with nature, beneath the surface is a ruthless savagery that is completely abhorrent. And while there is some variance within the Wood Elf society about the levels of savagery with which they agree to, ultimately they all have the same underlying principles, as it were. Now, of course, my anti-elf bias is definitely feeding into this, and I'd be curious as to what the author's intentions were, whether it was to present the Wood Elves as so thoroughly repugnant. But what's also interesting is there is another group of elves, Dark Elves, and they, within the framework of the story, fit a sort of antagonistic role. However, the way they are presented and the way the Wood Elves are presented, I was completely sympathetic with the Dark Elves and completely disliked the Wood Elves. And so any conflict, I would absolutely root for the Dark Elves to completely crush and obliterate the Wood Elves that we saw. So ultimately, it's a very interesting presentation of the elves, because on the surface, the Wood Elves seem very civilized, but quite frankly, from my perspective, they're not. And that makes for a very interesting story. And this is what makes Frida and Silas heroes that you can absolutely root for as they try to escape from this valley. It was bad enough that they were stuck in this forest far from civilization with seemingly no way of getting out. But then they get stuck in with elven society, and at first it seems civilized. But when they start to realize how absolutely messed up it is, you really want them to escape, and they desperately want to get away from everything. And this ultimately made Frida and Silas a lot more likable, not because they were unlikable, but you just felt a lot more for them. I really was rooting for them to get out, to do whatever it took to escape from the elves and from the valley, and to do whatever it took in order to do so. I felt like that was a very good bit of writing. So, in conclusion, it was a very interesting story with an escape theme to it, as Frida and Silas have to escape from the elves and the valley. And as I said, it was a fascinating take on the elves that I would be curious to see more of in the future from the author. And I'd also be interested in some of the other works set in the wider world. So, if that sounds at all interesting, I shall leave some links in the description below, including to the author's own website. So for now, allow me to plug my own book, The Dark One, the third book in the Mushroom Knight series, and let's have a nice close-up look of the cover. Oh yes, also, like the first two covers, very nice. This book has just been released as the saga of the Mushroom Knight Mila Hyphala continues in this epic and emotional installment. Well, that about wraps it up, so until next time, thanks for watching.